Hey y'all, welcome back to the Farmer's Table. If you're new here, my name is Jess and I'm so glad to have you here in my kitchen. And if you're not new here, I'm so glad that you're back. Here on my channel, we talk all about real food, preserving it, preparing it, loving it, and sharing it. I definitely love being able to feed my family well, knowing what is going into their food. Today, I want to talk to you about canning dry beans. I recently did a video kind of doing an introductory to canning, a one-on-one, very basic information. If you're completely bewildered by the idea of canning, make sure you go check that out because this really isn't a scary process. It actually provides us a lot of opportunity to make our dollar stretch in the kitchen and to be able to preserve food whenever it is in abundance and then use it even if we have an emergency situation like a power outage or a baseball game after school one day when you forgot to thaw something out. So on my counter right now, I've got a couple of containers of beans, which I soaked last night. On my stove, I have a big pot of beans that is coming to a boil. I'm planning on doing a couple of batches here today. And I just wanted to show you guys the process of taking dry beans and canning them, making them shelf stable and more convenient to use. Now, I like cooking with dry beans. It's great, but you do need to soak them the night before, which means you need to think ahead. I don't always do that very well. So I buy dry beans bulk in 25-pound bags. I like ordering them from Azure Standard. The beans we are canning today came from this 25-pound bag. They are organic Great Northern beans. You can do this exact same process with red beans, black beans, any of the beans that you have. We use Great Northern beans a lot for white bean chili. If I make baked beans, I'm going to use them. I have a couple of other different soups that we use. But I also can pinto beans and kidney beans and black beans as well for different uses. So you have a lot of options when you are canning beans. Of course, you can make a recipe and can them so that you have like baked beans already prepared to just pour in a pot and heat up. Today, I'm just super simple canning plain beans. I'm not adding anything to them. I like to at least have a baseline stock of plain ingredients so that I can wing it a little bit more. And then also sometimes I'll take it another step and then also make some flavored beans and different things for a specific use. Beans are a low acid food, meaning the recommended way to preserve them is through pressure canning. Right here I have my All-American 21 quart pressure canner heating up on the stove. I've got everything completely clean, which is an important thing. In the bottom of the canner, I have between 2 and 3 inches of water. That is heating up. I had the lid on for that purpose. Another thing that I've just done before I use this canner, and this is exclusive to the All-American because it's metal on metal, it doesn't have a gasket, is that I have oiled the edge of the gasket. I looked everything over when I got it out and made sure that it was all clean underneath here where the valve is. Everything is fully clean, it's wiped off, and then the gasket is oiled as well as the outside, as well as the inside of the gasket on this pan. Over here, I have the beans that I soaked last night. Before you can dry beans, you want to soak them overnight, which essentially just means pouring dry beans into a container and covering them with water. They are going to expand at least 3 times the size that they were. Probably safest to put them in a container where they could grow 4 times. I didn't give these enough space last night, and actually some of them kind of like expanded over the top and fell onto the counter. I had to get another container. So I would say I would have done better to put in maybe like this much and fill it up with water. So whenever I do that, I'm just pouring my beans into a container. I'm picking out any impurities that I see, like rocks or anything like that. I usually rinse them once and then cover them with the water to soak. Then this morning I took those soaked beans, I strained them out through a colander, rinsed them off completely. Dry beans are coming to you with whatever impurities were on them. A lot of times they are shelled out in the field, put in drying facilities, they're handled a lot. We definitely want to get them clean. I rinsed them off and then I put them in this pot and covered them with 2 inches of water, and I brought this to a boil. One of the biggest things that you have to be mindful of when you are canning is making sure that you're not introducing cold ingredients to hot water, hot ingredients to cold water. You are putting this stuff in glass jars, and any jarring changes in temperature is going to cause that glass to break. And we definitely don't want that, because that's a waste of our time and a waste of our food. So I'm bringing the beans up to a boil here. I am bringing the water that's in the bottom of my pressure canner up to a simmer. And over here I have my jars. Now these are clean jars. These are not sterilized jars. For the pressure canning process, you do not have to sterilize your stuff, because the pressure canner and the process itself will sterilize any impurities that were in this jar. You obviously want them to be visibly clean. If they were like visibly dirty, wash it off. Get it clean, but it doesn't have to be sterilized. So I actually store my canning jars in a building outside. We have a pantry building, and we keep that building pretty cool, which as of like right now, it's quite cool in there because it's cold outside. It does have temperature control, so it's not going to freeze. But when I bring jars in, sometimes they're very cold. And though I might not need to sterilize them, a lot of the times I will wash them out, or at least just run them under warm water that they can slowly warm up, so that I'm not putting boiling ingredients in a cold jar. So in preparation of canning this batch, I've got a towel. It's just a bathroom towel. I'm going to put this on the kitchen counter. All right, I just want to have a handy place that I can set my jars when they come out of the canner. I've got my jars, I've got a funnel, I have a ladle. With pressure canning, it's not as important to make sure that everything is sterilized. If I were doing water bath canning here, I would want to sterilize all the tools that I was using, because water bath canning is not processed at as high a temperature, and it's also not processed for as long. But here, I'm just going to fill my jars up with my beans that have been soaked and brought to a boil. And I want to leave 1 inch of headspace at the top of my jars, which is pretty easy to tell in like a wide mouth canning jar like this, because it's more or less like right to the top of the shoulder of the jar. And I'm going to put my beans in first and then ladle the liquid from this pot over them, but I want to stop right at that 1 inch headspace. When I'm packing these in, when I'm putting my beans in here, if I shake these, they're going to settle down, and you see how much more space that made? So I'm going to add a little bit more beans to this. I do not want to mash them in, press them in, pack them in any sort of way that's going to keep there from being some looseness and airflow, but I also don't want to can these and then end up with a whole bunch more space after they settle. So I'm just gonna, once I initially put them all in, I go through and shake all the jars, kind of spin them around a little bit, and let everything that's in there kind of press down to where it's going to end up being. Now I'm going to top them off with just a little bit more of the beans, and then we'll go back through and add the liquid over top. Now, I am using quart jars here. You can totally process pints if you don't need quart jars. I'm cooking for a crowd, you know, I mean, routinely, if I were using pint jars, I would have to open several of them to make a pot of chili. So quarts make more sense for my family. When we process these, and this is how it is with a lot of things in canning, you process quarts for longer than pints. So pints have to be processed for 75 minutes, quarts have to be processed for 90 minutes to make sure we reach the temperatures inside. Now some canners, you can do 2 layers. So with the quart jars, I can only do 7 jars in my canner. With pint jars, I can actually do, I don't usually do this, so I can't remember exactly what fits in. I don't know, you can do 2 layers of them. It's something like, I think 18 jars can fit in this size canner. Whenever you've got them stacked, you just put a rack in between them. So if you want pints for a purpose, it's not necessarily that you can process more in the canner in quarts. It's just what's easiest and makes most sense for your family. All right, now, very carefully, I'm going to ladle this liquid over top, stopping when I'm at 1 inch of headspace. All right, so my ingredients are packed in my jars here, and I have a knife. It's not sterilized because we're pressure canning. If this were water bath, we would want this to be a sterilized knife. And I'm going through and I'm just sliding this down along the ends and kind of pressing in, just like so. And what I'm doing here is just getting any air bubbles out. If you fail to do this, it's probably fine, but sometimes this is gonna make sure that my contents aren't gonna shift and leave any big gaps. This is less important with something like beans because obviously they kind of shift pretty easily and fill in all the spaces. But if you're canning something that's a little larger, this can be a pretty important step to make sure you have the right headspace. If this does cause any shifting that brought your ingredients down to a lower level than you wanted, just fill them back up with a little bit. Like, I think that one could use just a touch more of the liquid. So at this point, if you prefer it, you do not have to. It's not required for like the safety of canning. You can put a teaspoon of salt per quart or a half a teaspoon of salt per pint. I don't usually do that. I usually just go ahead and put my lids on as it is because I really like to have ingredients saved as simply as possible so that when I go to build my meal, I don't accidentally end up with a really oversalted dish because I was bringing salt in from multiple places. So I don't put salt on them. That's preference, you can choose. If you are wanting them to be more like store-bought beans have quite a bit of salt in them. So you can do what you will with that. Now I have a wet rag and I'm gonna wipe the rims off of these jars just to make sure that I don't have any of the food. I just put them sitting there on the rim because if you have anything standing between the edge of your jar and that compound in your lid, you're not gonna get the right seal and you're not gonna be able to store your food outside the refrigerator, which would defeat the purpose of everything we're doing. So we wanna get that nice and clean. And now I've got my quart wide mouth canning lids that fit these jars. I'm gonna go through and put one on the top of each prepared jar. My contents are still very hot. I have my canner simmering so that I'm gonna be putting hot jars in a hot canner. And here I'm going to take my lids, I actually need this to grab my jars because they are very warm. I'm going to take my rings and place them on top and tighten them down what's called finger tight, which I'm not trying to wrench them on there. I don't want them loose, but I just go as tight as I can comfortably do with the ends of my fingers. All right, now I have my handy dandy grabber, also known as a jar lifter, and I'm going to carefully lift these jars up by their shoulders and put them in my hot canner that has a couple inches of preheated water along the bottom. I want my jars to be close but not touching. Alright, with my jars in, as you can see, I mentioned I had a bit of water at the bottom. It's going up probably to about halfway on the jar, and that's good. Your canner should have instructions on it about like how much water needs to be in it for it to function properly. I can't remember what All Americans is. It's just kind of put about that much in there and it's fine. If you ever, like let's say you had your canner simmering while you were preparing everything and you put your jars in and realized, oh no, I don't have enough water in here. I almost always, when I start canning, I turn the kettle on for a boil, my electric kettle. And that way, if I need to throw some more water in there, I can throw boiling water in since I've got boiling contents in my jars, boiling water already in there. You definitely don't want to put cold water into that situation because the potential for thermal shock. I feel fine with these water levels, so now that I have my kettle on, I'll just make a cup of tea and that'll be nice. All right, here I have my canning lid. As I mentioned earlier, I've already oiled the gasket. I've made sure I don't see anything visibly blocking my vent, anything blocking underneath. And I'm going to put the lid on my canner, lining up this little arrow right here with this little dent in the side. All right. Now when I put the lid on this canner, it's really important that I tighten it down evenly, because if my lid is sitting kind of wonky, it's going to let the steam out and then I will not have the pressure that is required to pressure can. Have it too close to the wall. You got to be really careful moving your canner on the stove. So I'm going to lift these tighteners up and I'm going to tighten down the parallel sides. So I'll start here and evenly tighten down on each side at the same time, then move to the next one, evenly tightening down each side, and then the back here, evenly tightening this down. As far as like tightening them as far as I can go, I'm not insanely strong, so like that's not hard for me to hit the limit. I guess if you are like bodybuilding, maybe don't put everything you've got into it. It just needs to be secure. It needs to be fully tight that the steam isn't leaving. Now what's gonna happen here is that I have that boiling water at the bottom. I had the hot jars, so nothing is cooling off in there. And right now I've put the lid on, and the heat inside this pressure canner is going to begin building. So I have this gauge, and then I also have this vent. There is an emergency vent back here, which I made sure was cleaned off, which is why we really don't have to be afraid of pressure canning. They've thought of a backup plan. I've seen the viral clips and the videos where somebody blasted their pressure canner through the roof of their house. I have done a lot of canning at this point. There has never once been a single instance where I felt like I was in danger canning. I've always been fully aware of what's going on. Now, I would never leave my canner going and like go get in the shower. I would never leave my canner going and like go out into the garden. And I always can when I make sure I have enough time to finish it. This is a pretty time intensive process. So that's kind of like my caution in the approach, but you do not have to be afraid of a pressure canner, especially these modern ones. So this is a weighted canner, so here's my weight. And what I'm currently waiting for is I want steam to begin consistently venting out of this vent. Now you can kind of see we got a little something happening here, but this is not what we're looking for yet. And depending on how hot you started on with everything here, this might take a few minutes for this to really start building up. When that starts like pretty steadily venting, I put on a timer for 10 minutes. This is just a best practice. I'm gonna let that vent for 10 minutes, making sure everything is coming up to the full amount of steam, making sure that there's no blockages, and that is when I'm gonna put the weight on. All right, so several minutes later, the pressure canner is now venting. I've got it sitting on high heat. The steam is starting to come out. It's going to become a stronger stream, but when I can hear it very steadily venting is when I start my timer. You may notice at this point that a little bit of pressure is beginning to build. It is not going to get to the full amount of pressure until I put the weight on. So my timer's on now for 10 minutes that I've got a full vent going. Okay, 10 minutes later, I have vented this and I am going to put my weight on. So this weight has 3 numbers on it. There's 10, 15, and 5. And these are different places I can put my weight on, and this is going to determine the amount of pressure my pressure canner holds. So I'm going to very carefully drop this on at 10 pounds. Currently my canner's still on pretty high heat. I just turned it down a tiny bit, but basically right now this 10-pound weight is on, and it's almost at 10 pounds of pressure. When it hits 10 pounds of pressure, this is going to rattle for the first time. There we have it. That is our first rattle. Now, it's constantly rattling right now because it's really too much pressure in there. So I'm going to turn my heat down pretty significantly to about medium. You're going to have to find how this works. I'm sorry, that's going to be really annoying for a minute, but we have to deal with it. It's part of it. You're going to have to figure out the exact way your particular canner works with your range. This constant rattling right now is that when that rattles, it lets out some of the steam, as you can see here. Another way you can lessen the steam is by lowering the heat, but obviously, especially on like a glass top electric stove, that's not immediate. There's a lot of heat built up. So here's our goal. We want to hear at least 1 rattle per minute for the entirety of our processing time. The processing time begins at the first rattle. That means that we've hit the pressure that we need. So at that first rattle, I'm starting my timer for 90 minutes because I'm processing quarts of beans and they need 90 minutes of processing time. And right now, I'm gonna find the right temperature that it's not rattling constantly, because then it's just one, that's just terribly annoying, but also it's just hotter than it needs to be. We don't need there to be so much pressure in the canner that it's having a hard time venting that pressure. This is where the safety features come in, where we have like that emergency valve. If the pressure canner was in danger of like exploding because it had too much pressure, it would pop that emergency vent, and it would allow some of the steam to vent out. While I don't want it to rattle too much, I also don't want it to rattle too little. If it's going over a minute in between rattles on this pressure canner, that means that it's not staying at 10 pounds pressure, and we need it to stay at 10 pounds pressure for 90 minutes to make sure that our beans are safely canned. So this is going to feel stressful the first time that you do it because it's unfamiliar to you. I can tell you now, I can run this pressure canner, and it's like some program running on the backside of my brain that I don't even think a lick about. But whenever I start hearing it rattle a lot or not rattle enough, I'm like, oh, hey, go adjust the heat under the canner. Like, you get so used to it that it runs a little bit on autopilot. For me, what I usually settle in on is about medium heat under the canner. After that initial boil, I started on high heat, bring it up to the first rattle, and then I start to lower the heat. It usually settles in at about medium, where it'll rattle about once every minute. All right, guys, the timer is going off. I timed that well. I have to leave here in 5 minutes to get my kids. All right, so the next step, I'm just gonna turn the heat off and then do nothing. Basically what I want to let happen is I want to let the pressure in the canner naturally go down. I do not take the weight off yet. Just leave it alone, and when it drops down to 0 pressure at that point, I will take the weight off and get in here and unload my canner. When I get back, I'm gonna turn my next pot of beans on because I'm doing 2 more rounds of this. I'm canning beans all day. All right, just in this minute that I've been talking to you with the heat off, you can hear that this is settling down. You can hear that this is not shaking anymore. And so it's gonna go on the decline. I just got back from running down to get my kids. It's been maybe 15 minutes and my gauge is down. I'm gonna take the weight off. Do not grab this with your bare hand. It is incredibly hot. You can hear there's still a little bit of pressure in there, but not a lot. That's gonna vent out. I'm going to loosen these. Be careful. Your canner is very hot still. The outside of it can burn you. All right, so I'm going to carefully lift these jars out. They are extremely hot. Try to keep them for the most part level and set them out here to cool. Hey y'all, it's the next day. I actually was editing this video and realized that I failed to finish filming it. So back here on the counter, I have 21 quarts of beans, plain old white beans, canned and ready to go in my pantry. The next thing I do is when I wait till the next day, everything's cooled. I make sure all the seals are good, meaning this isn't popping up and down. The lid is secure. I do take these rings off for storage. It's just a best practice to make sure if you do have a failed seal, it will be very obvious to you, because if you have that thing holding the lid on, then you could have some spoilage, and it would be a bummer to think that you had a lovely jar of canned beans only to open to put it in your dinner and it smelled terrible. So upon editing this, I realized that I did leave out one thing, just for the measurement's sake. The ball canning suggests soaking 3/4 pound of beans per quart that you plan to can. So that's what you need to do your math, depending on how many batches it is that you're trying to run. I think I soaked something like, I didn't measure it, it was probably in the range of about 15-ish pounds of beans. Maybe it was a little more than that. And after canning 3 rounds, I had 1 pot left that I just cooked for dinner. And so that's why I don't usually measure it. I usually just cook whatever's left over. This is probably one of the easiest things that you could possibly pressure can. I very purposefully wanted to do like a very hands-on instruction on running a pressure canner with plain beans. If you have never pressure canned before, I think this is a really, really great thing to cut your teeth on as far as getting your pressure canning going. It's very beneficial because dry beans are so affordable, and turning them into a more conveniently used food is going to benefit you in your grocery budget, as well as honing the skill of pressure canning. Of course, there are lots of great recipes of things that you're gonna cook and prepare and put other ingredients in and then can, and we'll get to those. I will show you some of those things. However, I feel like if you're feeling hesitant about learning on something super cheap like dry beans would be a really great thing to dive off into. So I hope this helps you. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section down below, and let me know if you are going to bust out that canner for the first time and put some beans on your shelf. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today and all the days you do. I bless you. Until next time.